How we think complex cells evolved. What if you could absorb another organism and take on its abilities? Imagine you're swallowed a small bird and suddenly gain the ability to fly. Or if you engulfed a cobra and were then able to split poisonous venoms from your teeth. Throughout the history of life, specifically during the evolution of complex eukaryotic cells, things like these happened all the time. One organism absorbed another and united to become a new organism with the combined abilities of birth. We think that around 2 billion years ago, the only living organisms on Earth are prokaryotes, single-cell organisms like membrane-bound organisms. Let's look closely at just 3 of them. One was big, simple, blob-like cells, with the ability to absorb things by wrapping a cell membrane around them. Another was bacteria cell that converts the solar energy into sugar molecules through photosynthesis. A third used oxygen gas to break down materials like sugar and release its energy into a foam using further life activities. The black cells occasionally absorbed the little photosynthetic bacteria. These bacteria then lived inside the blob and divided like the related halves. Their existence became linked. If you stumble upon living arrangements, you might just think that the whole thing was one organism, that the green photosynthetic bacteria was just a part of the blob that performed one of its life functions, just like your heart is a part of unit that performs the function of pumping your blood. This process of cells living together is called endosymbiosis, one organism living inside another. By the end of endocytosis stopped there. What happened if the other bacteria moved in too? Now the cells of this species started becoming highly complex. They were big and full of interesting structures that we call chloroplasts and mitochondria. These structures work together to harness sunlight to make sugar and break down the sugar using the oxygen that right around this time started to appear in the Earth's atmosphere. Organisms absorbing other organisms was one way species adapted to the changing environmental conditions of their surroundings. This little story highlights what biologists call the endosymbiotic theory, the current best explanation of how complex cells evolved. There's a lot of evidence to support this theory, but let's look at 3 main pieces. First, the chloroplasts and mitochondria in our cell multiply the very same way as those ancient bacteria, which are still around by the way. In fact, if you destroy this structure in cell, no new one will appear. The cell can't make them. They can only make more of themselves. Second piece of evidence, chloroplasts and mitochondria both contain their own DNA and ribosomes. Their DNA has a circular structure that is strikingly similar to the DNA of the ancient bacteria, and it also contains many similar genes. The ribosome, or protein assembly genes of the chloroplasts and mitochondria, also have the same structure as ribosome of ancient bacteria, but are different from ribosomes hanging around the rest of your cell. Lastly, think about membranes involved in the engulfer process. Chloroplasts and mitochondria both have the 2 membranes around them, an inner and outer membrane. Their inner membrane contains some particular liquids and protein that are not present in outer membranes, like Y6 milk acid, because our membranes used to belong to blood cell. When we engulfed in the endocytosis process, they got wrapped on the membrane and kept their own as their inner one. Surely enough, those same lipids and protein are found on the membranes of ancient bacteria. Biologists now use this theory to explain the origin of the vast variety of eukaryotic organisms. Take the green algae that grow on the wall of the swimming pools. A large eukaryotic cells with a spinning tail structure were flagella. At some point absorbed algae like these to form what we now call euglena. Euglena can come from precursors break down sugar, use oxygen, and swim around the pond water. And as the theory was predicts, the chloroplasts in used planet have the three members, since they have two before it be engulfed. The observing process of endosymbiotic theory allows organisms to combine powerful abilities to become better adapted of life on Earth. The result was species capable of much more than they were separate organisms, and this was evolutionary leap. They left microorganisms, plants, and animals we observed on the planet today. One more. What if you could observe another organism and take on its abilities? Imagine you swallowed a small bird and suddenly gained the ability to fly. Or if you engulfed a cobra and were then able to spit poisonous venom from your teeth. Throughout the history of life, specifically during the evolution of complex eukaryotic cells, things like this happened all the time. One organism absorbed another, and you might want to become a new organism with the combined abilities of both. We think that around 2 billion years ago, with only living organisms on Earth are prokaryotes. Single-cell organisms like membrane-bound organelles. Let's look closely at just three of them. One was the big, simple, blob-like cell, with the ability to absorb things by wrapping a cell membrane around them. Another was a bacteria cell that converted solar energy into the sugar molecules through photosynthesis. Also, they used the oxygen gas to break down materials like sugar and release its energy into a form useful for life activities. The blood cell would occasionally absorb the little photosynthetic bacteria. These bacteria that live inside the blood and they might like they always had, but their existence became linked. If you stumbled the living arrangements, you might just think the whole thing was one organism, that the green photosynthetic bacteria was just a part of the blob that performed one of the life functions, just like your heart is a part of you performs the function of pumping your blood. This process of cell living together is called endosymbiosis, one organism living inside another. By the end of this does not stop there. What happened if the other bacteria moved in too? Now the cells of this species started becoming highly complex. They were big and full of interesting structures we call chloroplasts and mitochondria. These structures work together to harness the sunlight to make sugar and break down the sugar using the oxygen that light around this time starting to appear in the Earth's atmosphere. Organisms absorbing the other organisms was one way species adapted to the changing environmental conditions of their surroundings. This little story highlights what biologists call the endosymbiotic theory, the current best explanation of how complex cells evolved. There is a lot of evidence to support this theory, so let's look at the three main pieces. First, the chloroplasts and mitochondria in our cells multiplies the very same way as those ancient bacteria, which was still around by the way. In fact, if you could destroy the structure in the cell, no new ones will appear. The cells can make only more of themselves. Second piece of evidence. Chloroplasts and mitochondria both contains their own DNA and ribosomes. Their DNA has a certain structure that is strongly similar to the DNA of the ancient bacteria, and it also contains many similar genes. The ribosome, or protein assembly machines of chloroplasts mitochondria, also have the same structure as ribosomes of ancient bacteria, but are different from the ribosomes hanging around the rest of a eukaryotic cell. Lastly, think about the memories involved in the engulfing process. Chloroplasts and mitochondria both have the two membranes surrounding them, an inner and outer membrane. Their inner membrane contains some particular lipids and proteins that are not present in the outer membrane. Why is this significant? Because their outer membranes used to belong to the blood cell. When they were engulfed in the endosymbiosis process, they got wrapped up in the membranes and kept their own as their inner one. Surely enough, the same lipase proteins found in the membranes of the ancient bacteria. Biologists now use this theory to explain the origin of the vast variety of eukaryotic organs. Take the green algae that grow on the wall of swimming pools. A large eukaryotic cell with a spinning tail structures or a flagella at some point absorbed algae like these to form what we now call euglena. Euglena can perform photosynthesis, break down sugar using oxygen, and swim around the pond water. And as the theory would predict, the quality process in these euglena have the three members, since they have the tube before being engulfed. The observing process of endosystem theory allows organisms to combine powerful abilities to become better adapted to life on Earth. The results were species capable of much more than they were separate organisms, and this was evolutionary leap that led to the microorganisms, plants, and animals we observed on the planet together.